Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Broad Eye podcast. My name is Sean Maloney, and today I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Dennis Levi. Dr. Levi is a professor at the UC Berkeley School of Optometry. Dr. Levi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Sean.
It's my pleasure. So we're going to dive into a number of topics today. And I have to be honest with you, even though I have some background in eye disease as a patient and a researcher, the stuff that you do is very complex. It's phenomenal, but very complex. So even for someone who's been tangentially, I guess, in the space. So but I'm sure you can break it down for me and for the audience. So maybe we can start there. And if you just start with a little overview of, the kind of research that you do at your Berkeley lab.
Sure. So research in our lab is really focused on how we perceive forms, visual forms and patterns, and how form perception and binocular vision are degraded by abnormal visual experience early in life, and particularly in people who have amblyopia. Amblyopia is a neurodevelopmental loss of vision in one eye, less commonly in both eyes, and that mostly is in underdeveloped countries where there's poor access to healthcare. The most common form of vision loss in children, besides refractive error, that is farsightedness or nearsightedness, in fact, is amblyopia. So it's a problem that affects maybe 2 to 3% of the population. And amblyopia comes about when the two eyes don't get the same input early in life, either because one eye has a blurred image while the other one is clear. That's called anisometropia. The patient has unequal refractive error in the two eyes, needs different prescriptions for the two eyes, or the two eyes are not aimed at the same object because one is turned, eye turn or strabismus. Those are the two most common causes of amblyopia, and it always develops early in life, typically in the first few years, by age 4 to 6. And the treatment generally and most currently is limited to children. So we're interested in what aspects of amblyopic vision are compromised and what aspects are spared, where's the damage and what are the underlying neural abnormalities, how it relates to normal vision, in particular form and depth perception. And it can teach us a lot about brain plasticity because amblyopia can be treated, particularly in young children, but we're trying to push the boundaries and improve vision in adults with amblyopia and older children too. And the overarching goal in our lab is to try to develop and test new methods to diagnose and treat these abnormalities, both in children and adults.
And thanks for that overview of the amblyopia as well. But it just brings up a whole slew of questions that I have, and I'll try to fire them one by one here. So you mentioned in brain plasticity. There's a general belief, or at least there was once upon a time. I'm sure maybe you can comment on that, but that the brain can be more plastic or more able to change earlier on versus as we're older, and maybe that's a dogma that's been challenged. But are there when you talk about amblyopia, are there cortical level changes that are happening also whenever someone develops amblyopia and whenever they undergo treatment, or is that even known?
Absolutely. So we believe that amblyopia is primarily a cortical problem. The retina, there might be some subtle changes in the retina, but the main changes that occur in the amblyopic visual system, and we know a lot of this from physiology studies in animal models, and also now from human brain imaging, The main changes occur first in the primary visual cortex, where information from the two eyes comes together. And we also think that there are changes with treatment, that is, those changes occur in the brain. So we consider amblyopia to be primarily a cortical problem, a cortical issue. It's a brain problem.
Okay, no, that's just, I guess it's interesting because we would often think of it as this is an eye problem, but it is an eye problem with origins in the brain, I guess. That Now, how do you study that? Like, what are some of the research methodologies that people might use to I need more coffee to study both at the level of the eye, but also at the level of the brain to see changes that might be taking place.
Yeah. So in our lab, because we deal with humans, we use a broad range of methods, including what's called psychophysics, eye tracking. We do modeling, computational modeling and neuroimaging to study the neural mechanisms and to learn how they're degraded. So if you like, I could give a little more detail about what each of those methods entails.
That'd be great, because I know a little bit about all of those things, but not a lot about any of them. So yeah, if you don't mind diving into that, then that'd be great.
Sure. So basically, psychophysics, anybody who's ever been to an eye doctor has been a subject for psychophysics experiment. When your visual acuity is being measured, the doctor is measuring the limit of your spatial vision. What's the smallest detail that you can read? And in fact, George Wald, who got the 1967 Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology, did some of the earliest careful psychophysics in patients with amblyopia, and showed that amblyopia is primarily a problem of form perception and not of light perception, suggesting that the retinal receptors, the rods and the cones, were intact and that the damage is in the visual cortex. So we use psychophysics. It's a very old methodology, actually invented in the 1800s by Gustav Fechner, who was interested in formally describing the relationship between sensation, what we see, what's in our mind, and the energy, what's in the world that gives rise to that sensation. And he called this psychophysics, from psycho for your mind and physics for matter. And he made some of the first objective measurements of psychological events through new ways to measure what we see and what we hear and what we feel. And we use psychophysics to find out what patients with amblyopia can see and what they have difficulty seeing. So, for example, a patient with amblyopia has no trouble seeing big, rapidly moving objects, a truck coming along in their peripheral vision, no problem. They are very much less sensitive to small, low contrast objects with their amblyopic eye. They're also very susceptible to what we call crowding, which is the notion that they can see letters when they're presented in isolation, a single letter at a time. But if you present them with a line of letters, they get lost. They really have trouble. So those surrounding contours make it much more difficult to see. And when both eyes are viewing, we've learned from psychophysics that the strong eye suppresses or inhibits the weak one. So, and this is again something that occurs in the brain, where information from the two eyes first comes together. We use computer modeling to not only describe how things work, but also to try to better understand the circuits, and makes predictions about how the visual system will respond to specific stimulus conditions. We use various neuroimaging methods like EEG, which is the electrical activity from your brain, which measures the activity of dozens well, you can put dozens of electrodes on the scalp and record from whole populations of neurons to measure their activity. You don't really know exactly where in the brain that information is coming from, but there's very high temporal resolution, so you can tell quite a lot. In fact, part of my PhD work involved, many years ago, involved EEG in patients with amblyopia. And we showed that the neural responses from the brain were smaller and were also delayed when viewing with the amblyopic eye. Another neuroimaging procedure that's been very useful in the last 20 years or so is functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, where you can see the activity of the living brain. The critical factor here is that active brain tissue is hungry brain tissue. It needs oxygen. And so oxygen and other metabolites are supplied by the blood. And you can pick up that blood flow, the changes in blood flow, with an MRI device. And that gives rise to this technique called functional MRI, which allows you to see which areas light up when you're looking at a particular kind of visual stimulus or doing a particular task. And so we've learned a lot from functional imaging about the brain's role in amblyopia. A related technique is MRS, or magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which can tell us about the inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain called GABA, which arises when there are inhibitory interactions. And so you can measure the amount of this neurotransmitter using MRAS. So those are some of the techniques. And then eye tracking. You can learn a lot about somebody's vision by just tracking their eye movements with a sensitive eye tracker. So one of my graduate students, Avi Eisenman, has been looking at using eye tracking to see improvements in vision when patients are being treated, and finding that you can actually, that the changes in their eye movements actually mirror the improvements in their vision as they go through treatment. So those are some of the techniques that we use.
Thanks for giving that overview. The first question that comes up here as a follow-up is, you mentioned that amblyopia is something that is generally, at least in the Western world, treated young, when kids are 4 or 6 years old, whatever that may be, but that in some areas with less access to diagnostics and follow-up and eye care in general, that these people will go blind from amblyopia. That is something that could otherwise be relatively treatable in most cases. So as these people who do, I say go blind, they'll lose vision in that eye because the brain will essentially block it out for the various reasons that you mentioned. Can that, with adults, that function be recovered? And if so, how do you go about doing that? Is it the same methods used for helping kids, or are there more innovative or different methods that you're using, that the collective you in the space are using to address this?
Yeah, so a great question. So firstly, you nicely corrected yourself, because nobody with amblyopia is blind. The peripheral vision is pretty good in that eye, in the amblyopic eye. Large objects that are moving quickly can be readily seen. But their ability to read see fine detail, read easily with the amblyopic eye, see small objects that have low contrast are severely compromised. We believe that, so the standard treatment, let me just say that for the last 250 plus years has been to patch the strong eye to, in quotes, force the weak eye to work. And in young children, so giving them the proper optical correction and then patching in young children is pretty successful if they'll wear the patch, which is a whole nother story in itself, because as you can imagine, most young children don't really want to be going around with an eye patch for months at a time. And that kind of treatment is generally not provided to older patients. And partly because of this idea that plasticity wanes in beyond some critical age of maybe 6 or 7 or 8, depending on who you believe or who you read. But it turns out that you can treat amblyopia in older patients. And it just takes different methods, I believe. And so one of the problems with amblyopia, of course, is the fact that you've got the strong eye that dominates the weak eye and suppresses it. So another problem is that because the information from the amblyopic eye is kind of noisy and unreliable, the brain will not pay attention to it often. So if you can do something to get that patient using information from the amblyopic eye, that can be an effective way of treating amblyopia or improving their vision. So, for instance, we know from a lot of work in people with normal vision that if they just do repeated practice of a difficult perceptual task, some near threshold visual task, for instance, they get better. That's called perceptual learning. And that improvement is often very long lasting. We believe that it results in neural changes in the brain. And it turns out that doing something like that in patients with amblyopia, in adults with amblyopia, results in improved vision too. So there have been a number of studies, and in fact, involving hundreds of patients in labs around the world that have shown that adults can improve their vision. Adults with amblyopia can improve their vision by perceptual learning. Now, they might not get to normal, but they can improve. Another approach that is more recent, and that's really been pushed by Robert Hess at McGill and his colleagues, is the idea that you need to actually try to counteract the suppression. So treatment that involves both eyes, where you try to give the amblyopic eye a leg up so that it will not be suppressed, so that it can overcome the suppression from the preferred eye. And many of those studies in labs have shown improvements in vision. So there are also a number of case reports of a patient with amblyopia in one eye who loses their strong eye, the other eye, through a disease or injury or accident, and spontaneously recovers vision. So we know that it's possible to improve vision. Again, maybe not to normal, maybe not as easily in older patients as in young children, but certainly I believe that you can improve vision in older patients, and and we've had patients in their 60s and 70s who have shown improvements.
No, that's phenomenal. Now you mentioned Robert Hess's research. Is this so I actually went to McGill. Is this the same research that I'm just trying to remember a number of years ago where they were using like a VR headset or something and they were playing Tetris, and then one eye was the piece was falling, but you couldn't see the bottom of the screen. The other eye was the bottom of the screen, and it was forcing them to work together or something like that. Is that the same research?
Same research, yeah. And of course,
Yeah. Okay.
Robert's done a whole bunch of more studies and different kinds of. The idea of using video games, by the way, is one that we've pushed too. And it turns out even playing video games just with the amblyopic eye while you patch the other eye for an hour or so a day over a course of about 40 hours gives a line or two improvement in visual acuity in adults with amblyopia.
And does that last? That
Yeah,
change? Is that really?
The studies that have looked at follow-up, and not all studies look at follow-up, and the follow-up is typically being done for a year or as much as a year or two, it seems to stick, at least as well as the effects of patching, which doesn't always stick either.
So you mentioned about video games, and I know your lab has ventured into this space as well, and you have some pretty significant research that's been published in that space. So I was hoping maybe you can just talk a little bit about what your group has done with respect to amblyopia related research in a video game type of environment.
Absolutely, happy to do that. So we like video games, and in fact, the first study that used video games to try to treat amblyopia was done in my lab in collaboration with Roger Lee, who has been working with me for a long time. And we had adults play a shoot 'em up action video game about an hour a day for over the course of 40 hours. And this is with their amblyopic eye and the other eye being patched. And we found that they improved by 1 to 2 lines just by playing video games with their amblyopic eye. And it turns out in controlled studies that it doesn't have to be a shoot 'em up game, which is good because for little kids, you certainly don't want them to be shooting up their
anything, right? Anything.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. We're even in America. But one of the big issues with amblyopia is not only the poor visual acuity, but their binocular vision, the ability to use the two eyes together, and their stereovision, the ability to see things in depth. And so we've been really trying to use video games to improve both visual acuity, but also stereovision. And we're sort of inspired in this venture by a couple of reports. One was by Sue Barry. You might have heard of her. Oliver Sacks wrote a piece about her called her Stereo Sue. Sue Barry was a neuroscientist, actually. She's and in her 60s, she had, and she'd been a strabismic. She'd had a turned eye pretty much most of her life. She had some very poor stereo, and she went through a vision training with an optometrist, and she regained stereo, and she wrote this book describing what happened and how she felt about it. And she describes sitting in her car after a session and all of a sudden seeing the steering wheel popping out towards her in depth, something that she hadn't ever perceived before. And then she looked up and she could see that the trees had volume, that the leaves were closer, the branches were closer than the trunk. And it had this very, very beautiful description of 3D vision. And she said that, if you've never had 3D vision before, you can't imagine what you're missing. And then once you get it, you want to keep it. So that was one observation, that it's possible for an adult to get stereo and that they see something that actually improves their life. And another piece that was written by the late Bruce Bridgman, who is a psychology professor at UC Santa Cruz, who also had strabismus, turned eye, most of his life, and had poor stereo, and took his grandson, Bruce too was in his 60s, took his grandson to see the movie Hugo. And he thought, why would I want to waste $14 on the headset to see a 3D movie, but I would look like kind of a dork if I didn't, because everybody else in the movie theater is going to be wearing the headset. So he put on the headset, and to his glee and surprise, he was able to see things in 3D, in depth. And his first thought was, well, the disparities in the movie, the amount of depth that's actually built into the 3D movie was huge, much bigger than occurs in natural scenes. It's so exaggerated that maybe that's why he was seeing it. But then he left the movie theater and he saw things in 3D, in real life, outside the movie theater. And he had this hypothesis that it was, paying attention to these large disparities, this large depth information, 3D depth information, that was useful. And so we've done a number of studies and learned, I think, some of the important principles of treating vision to improve stereo vision. And one of the important principles is to try to get the input to the brain equal from the two eyes. That is, the amblyoptic eye is sending these weak and noisy signals, but if you give it a stronger signal than the good eye, you can sort of equalize them perceptually so that the information going to the brain is perceptually equal. Getting the images aligned in the two eyes so that the same parts of the retina are looking at the same parts of the visual scene, which is really important in somebody who's got an eye turn. Providing this large depth information inspired by Bruce Bridgman. And another thing that I think was done in the movie Hugo, and perhaps in a lot of 3D movies, is that there's a lot of two-dimensional information in a visual scene that gives the perception of depth, of distance. Things like occlusion. If something is in front of something else, it might block out your view of that other thing or part of the other thing. So you can infer depth. There's perspective cues. Rail lines look like they kind of converge in the distance. And artists know how to use that information so that the scene looks three-dimensional, even though it's on a flat screen. And so the other thing that is done in 3D movies, and that Hugo did very well, is to match up the 2D information with the 3D information. And so we had this idea that maybe you could use all of these things and use the 2D information as kind of training wheels, as a scaffold for depth perception. And all of these can be easily realized in virtual reality. So that's the thing that VR is very good for, because the two eyes have separate screens. You can provide high contrast to the weak eye and low contrast to the strong eye to kind of equalize the input to the brain. You can shift images so that they're properly aligned. You can make the depth information, the 3D depth information, big, and you can add 2D information and remove it. one of my graduate students, and Angie Godinez, who's now a postdoc in Berlin, just published a paper recently in Scientific Reports, providing a proof of concept of this idea. What we did was to develop virtual reality games that encompass all of these principles, where you have both 3D and 2D cues, and then you take out the 2D cues so that they are no longer, you kind of take away the training wheels. And all of our observers, all of our subjects, who are both in normal subjects, but also patients who had poor or no stereo, improved in their stereo, including some who had no stereo that we could measure before they did the training and had measurable stereo after. And another virtual reality study that we did in collaboration with Daphne Bavillier showed that these improvements occur because initially the brain essentially ignores the 3D information because they're noisy and unreliable. And what the brain learns is to attend to and give more weight to the 3D cue as training progresses. And so they start to use the 3D information. And again, virtual reality turns out to be a really good way of doing this.
Well, the other thing about virtual reality is you're talking about with kids and eye patches and compliance. I feel like if you give them the choice of an eye patch or virtual reality to treat your condition, you're going to get 100% compliance with virtual reality when you're dealing with 4 and 6 year olds, right? So
exactly, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. You could have asked kids 250 years ago. So do you want an eye patch or you want a video game?
Yeah.
So just maybe one or two more questions, if you don't mind. But you alluded to perceptual learning.
Yeah.
Can perceptual learning have a place outside of amblyopia? And I just automatically think about like sports performance and stuff like this. Is that something that actually happens, or am I just imagining?
Oh, no, you're not imagining it. It's perceptual learning, and people use different names too, so it's not always called perceptual learning, but perceptual learning is being used in a wide range of different conditions, and in training things like sports. So yeah, you can definitely.
Okay. So now that leads me into my last question. You hold a Guinness World Record. Maybe you can talk a little about that, and then if that has anything to do with perceptual learning, or maybe what the origin or the link is to this Guinness record.
So it's a cute story. My long-term collaborator and friend Stanley Klein. This was done back when I was at the University of Houston, and Stan was also a faculty member there, and we collaborated. And we were again interested in studying form and spatial vision and looking at the limits using psychophysics. And it turns out that there's a range of tasks that we are super good at, and they are all involve sensing the relative location of objects. So imagine two lines that are, let's say, horizontal and pointing at each other, just touching. And if you shift one of the lines up a little bit, you can see that it's shifted upward. Or if you shift it down, you can see that it's shifted downward. And it turns out that we can see those relative position changes with an accuracy that is way smaller than the smallest cones in the back of the eye, in the retina. Just a few arc seconds. So these tiny shifts. And we wanted to see, is there a way that you can actually, and there are a number of theories about how this is done. Obviously, it involves a level of perception that goes beyond the retina. And so there were a number of theories about where in the brain it's done and how it's done. And we wanted to push the limit and find out, well, what is the best hyperacuity you can do? And so we actually found out that it's possible under very special circumstances in a very well-practiced, and this is where perceptual learning might have come in, observer, that was me, that that you could actually do a hyperacuity task with an accuracy of less than 1 arc second. That's tiny. It's like, seeing the wing of a fly moving from a large distance away. And we had a paper that was just accepted and for publication when Stan's daughter came to visit him. She'd been living in Los Angeles with her mom, and she came to Houston and she said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And Stan got very excited and he said, "We've been doing this cool experiment and we found this incredible hyperacuity." And his daughter, being inquisitive 12-year-old, I think at the time, went to the library and then she came back and she said, "Dad, the Guinness Book of Records has the world's best vision as being this East German woman who purportedly can recognize faces from 2 kilometers. And that seems pretty unscientific." So she sent a copy of this just accepted or just published paper to the Guinness Book of Records and said, "Your entry seems quite unscientific, and here's evidence that Dennis Levi was able to do this hyperacuity task repeatedly with an accuracy of less than 1 arc second." And so Guinness put it in the Book of Records and took out the German lady.
So at some point,
so it was pretty exciting.
Maybe we shouldn't publish this episode because the audience, there's going to be somebody in the audience who listens to this and saying, "I can do that. I can do better. I can dethrone this guy." And that's cool. That's an interesting story. So, but no. Listen, this has been fun. I've really enjoyed this. Delved into areas of vision that are certainly not my field of expertise by any stretch. So I hope my questions were not too basic or too off, but I do appreciate you giving a nice overview of the field, of the research that your group has done and others. I think it's something that our audience is certainly going to enjoy. So I want to thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Sean. I had fun too. And yeah, your questions were great. So
thank you.
Take care.
And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.